Before touching a rake, a scarifier, or a single bag of seed, you need to know what you're actually dealing with, and there is a simple test that tells you almost immediately take a small tuft of that straw-colored grass and give it a gentle but firm tug. If it resists, holding on to the soil, and you can see a bit of pale green or cream color right down at the base where the leaf meets the soil, that plant is alive. It has pulled its energy down into the crown and shut off everything above ground to conserve what it has left, which is exactly what grass is supposed to do when conditions turn hostile. If instead the tuft comes away easily with almost no resistance, and the roots underneath look dry, brittle, and straw-like all the way through, that section has actually died and no amount of watering or feeding is going to bring it back. Most lawns going through this look uniformly bad from a distance, but pulling a handful of grass from several different spots usually reveals a mix of both. Genuinely dormant grass sitting right next to smaller patches that have properly died, and treating the whole lawn as one single problem is where a lot of people go wrong from the very start. Run this test in 5 or 6 different spots across the lawn rather than just one, paying particular attention to areas that get more direct sun or sit on thinner soil, since those tend to be the first places real death actually shows up rather than simple dormancy. Once you know what you're dealing with, water is where the real recovery work begins, and it is also where most people make their first mistake. The instinct is to get the hose out and soak the lawn every single evening, thinking more water can only help. But that instinct misses something important. A lawn that has been through a proper dry spell often develops what is called hydrophobic soil, meaning the top layer has baked hard enough that water actually beads up and runs straight off the surface instead of soaking in. The same way water behaves on a waxed car bonnet rather than sinking into it. Pouring more water onto ground in that state mostly just wastes it down the drain or into the nearest flower bed. And it is exactly why some people swear they have been watering diligently for weeks with nothing to show for it, when the truth is most of that water never actually reached a single root. A simple trick borrowed from professional groundskeepers fixes this without buying anything exotic, mixing a small amount of ordinary washing up liquid into a watering can or a hose end sprayer, and applying it across the dry area. The soap acts as a wetting agent, breaking the surface tension of the water so it actually penetrates the baked soil instead of sitting on top of it. You will often see the difference within the very first application, with water visibly soaking in, rather than pooling and running off the way it did before. And a lawn that seems stubbornly resistant to every watering session before this point often responds within a single week, once the surface is actually letting moisture through properly. Once that layer is broken, switch to deep, infrequent watering rather than a light daily sprinkle, aiming for a proper soak roughly once a week rather than little, and often, since shallow frequent watering keeps roots sitting near the surface exactly where the heat did the most damage in the first place. With the water situation sorted, the next real question is whether the lawn actually needs scarifying at all, and this is where timing matters enormously. Scarifying is the process of raking or machine combing out the dead thatch and moss sitting between the soil and the green growth, and it is genuinely one of the most useful things you can do for a struggling lawn, but only at the right moment. Doing it while the lawn is still bone dry and dormant just adds mechanical damage on top of drought stress, tearing into grass that has no spare energy to recover from the disturbance, which is exactly where most of the horror stories about scarifying ruining a lawn actually come from. People blame the scarifying itself when the real problem was doing it at completely the wrong time. The fix is simply waiting. Once you see the first proper rain, or you have been watering deeply for a week or two, and the dormant sections are showing genuine signs of green returning, that is the point where scarifying actually helps rather than hurts, since the plant finally has enough active growth and stored energy to recover from the disturbance rather than being knocked further backward by it. A quick way to check whether scarifying is even needed in the first place is pushing a finger straight down into the turf. If you meet spongy resistance before reaching firm soil underneath, there is a real thatch layer worth removing. If your finger reaches soil easily, the lawn is thin rather than clogged, and scarifying will not do much for you beyond adding unnecessary stress. A thin, patchy lawn without much thatch actually needs the opposite approach. Going straight to overseeding once conditions allow rather than raking out a thatch layer that was never really the problem to begin with. So this quick check genuinely changes which path the rest of your recovery should take. Getting this specific timing right, rather than jumping straight to the most aggressive fix, the moment a lawn looks rough, is exactly the kind of judgment call the ebook I put together walks you through in detail. The QR code is on screen now, or grab the link in the description if you want to check it out. While you're working through the lawn, it is worth spiking or aerating it too, particularly in the areas that took the worst of the damage, since those spots are very often the same ones dealing with compacted soil underneath. Anywhere that saw heavy foot traffic, a trampoline that sat in one place all summer, or a paddling pool parked on the grass for weeks, tends to bake harder and recover slower than the rest of the lawn. Because compacted soil sheds water in exactly the same way the hydrophobic patches do, just for a different underlying reason. A simple garden fork pushed a few inches into the ground every few inches across those specific areas, then rocked gently back and forth, opens up channels for water and air to actually reach the roots again. You do not need a hired machine for a typical home lawn, unless the compaction is severe and widespread, since a fork covers a reasonable area in an afternoon without much expense at all. Pay particular attention to any path that gets walked regularly. Whether that is a shortcut across the lawn to a gate or a route the family dog wears down every day, since repeated pressure in the exact same spot compacts soil far more severely than general foot traffic spread across the whole yard. Once the genuinely dead patches are cleared of debris and the soil underneath is loosened, that is your window for overseeding, and this step is where a surprising number of people undo their own good work by rushing it. Scattering seeds straight onto bare, crusted soil or a thin layer of leftover thatch typically gives you disappointing germination, since the seed never actually makes proper contact with the soil it needs to root into, and a huge portion of it either washes away in the next rain or gets picked off by birds before it has any real chance to sprout. Raking the surface lightly first, broadcasting seed evenly across it, then pressing it down firmly, whether that means walking over it using a roller or even dragging something flat and heavy across the area, dramatically improves how much of that seed actually takes. Match the seed mix to what the rest of your lawn is already growing where possible. And if drought was the reason you're dealing with this in the first place, a blend leaning on fescue and modern ryegrass varieties bred for better drought tolerance gives the new grass a genuinely better shot at handling the next dry spell than simply replacing like for like with whatever was there before. Fescue in particular tends to develop a deeper root system than many standard lawn grasses, which is exactly the trait that helps a plant reach moisture further down in the soil once the surface has dried out, and mixing it in with a modern dwarf ryegrass variety gives you both that resilience and a reasonably quick, tidy germination on top of it. A light scattering of seed compost or fine topsoil over the top afterward helps keep the seedbed consistently damp during germination without burying it so deep it never breaks the surface. Watering changes completely once seed is down, and this is worth separating clearly from the deep weekly watering you settled into earlier. Freshly sown seed has no root system yet to draw on, so it needs light watering roughly twice a day for the first couple of weeks. Just enough to keep the surface consistently damp without ever letting it dry out completely, since a seed that germinates and then dries out before its roots develop simply dies right back. This is genuinely the one situation in the entire recovery process where frequent light watering is the correct approach, rather than the mistake it usually is on an established lawn, so do not let the deep and infrequent rule you just learned confuse you here. Once you see genuine new growth reaching an inch or two in height, you can start easing back toward the normal deep and infrequent routine, tapering the frequency down gradually rather than switching overnight, since a sudden change from daily light watering to a single weekly soak can shock young roots that have only just started developing. Stay off newly seeded areas entirely during this stretch too, since foot traffic on ground this soft and freshly disturbed undoes a lot of the careful preparation that got you to this point. And a single afternoon of kids or pets running across a freshly seeded patch can flatten weeks of germinating grass in minutes. A couple of other habits are worth avoiding while all of this is playing out. Mowing a dormant straw-colored lawn short to tidy it up while you wait for it to recover does more harm than good, since cutting into a plant that has almost nothing left above ground stresses it right when it can least afford it, and there is very little length left to safely remove in the first place. If you do need to mow at all during this stretch, raise the deck as high as it will go and only trim the very tips, rather than cutting back down to a normal summer height. Reaching for a weed killer at this stage is another common misstep, since a lawn that looks patchy and rough during recovery is often blamed on weeds moving in, when most of what you're actually looking at is simply grass regrowing unevenly, and spraying a stressed, recovering lawn with anything at all just adds another layer of chemical stress on top of everything it is already dealing with feeding. The lawn through this recovery deserves its own moment of care, because reaching for a strong, fast-acting nitrogen feed the moment things start looking better is a tempting mistake. A lawn coming out of drought, stress benefits more from a feed leaning toward potassium, which supports root development and general resilience, rather than one pushing hard on nitrogen and forcing a burst of leafy growth the plant does not yet have the root system to properly support. Nitrogen-heavy feeds are exactly what you want later, in a normal season when the goal is lush, fast growth. But applying one too early in a recovery asks a plant that just spent everything it had surviving a drought to immediately turn around and sprint, which tends to leave it just as vulnerable to the next stretch of stress as it was before any of this started. Once the lawn is a few weeks into genuine recovery and showing consistent new growth, transitioning to a more balanced feed appropriate for the season makes sense. But starting with something gentler gives the roots the chance to catch up first, rather than asking the top growth to sprint ahead of them. If you're unsure exactly which feed and which timing fits your specific situation, walking through that decision properly rather than guessing at a garden center shelf is precisely what the ebook I put together is designed to help with. The QR code is on screen now, or check the link in the description if that sounds useful. It is worth setting realistic expectations for how this whole process actually unfolds, since nothing here happens overnight. Dormant grass that was never actually dead typically starts showing genuine green within 2 to 3 weeks of consistent proper watering. Once the crown has enough moisture to justify pushing new growth back up, overseeded patches take a bit longer, usually needing several weeks before they blend in visually with the surrounding lawn. And a full, even recovery across a badly affected lawn often stretches out over a full growing season rather than a single fortnight. That timeline is not a sign anything has gone wrong. It is simply how long it takes a stressed plant to rebuild the root system and energy reserves it spent surviving the drought in the first place. And rushing any part of this process, whether that means scarifying too early or feeding too aggressively, tends to set the whole recovery back further than it moves it forward. People who check on progress daily often feel like nothing is happening, simply because day-to-day change is genuinely too gradual to notice, while a comparison photo taken every week or two usually tells a completely different, far more encouraging story. So to bring this all together, start with the tug test to separate what is genuinely dormant from what has actually died. Fix hydrophobic soil with a wetting agent before you worry about watering volume. Hold off on scarifying until the lawn shows real signs of recovery, rather than doing it while everything is still bone dry. Spike the compacted hotspots, overseed with proper seed-to-soil contact rather than scattering, and hoping water newly seeded areas lightly and often while easing established sections back onto a deep weekly schedule. Feed gently with potassium before pushing hard on nitrogen, and leave the mower and the weed killer alone until the lawn has genuinely started recovering rather than reacting to how rough it looks in the middle of the process. Handle it in that order, and a lawn that looks like straw right now genuinely can look like a normal lawn, again, within a season, without needing to strip it out and start completely from scratch. The whole approach really comes down to working with what the plant is already trying to do on its own, rather than fighting against it or panicking into a fix it never actually needed. If you want the complete plan for exactly what your lawn needs and when, so you're never just guessing your way through a recovery like this, the ebook I wrote is linked in the description below, or scan the QR code on screen to grab it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.